This FedGov Today program is sponsored by Maximus. On this edition of FedGov Today with Frances Rose, fighting fraud at your agency is partly a leadership issue.
You need to have the tone at the top and throughout the agency to promote an attitude and an awareness of combating fraud and what that means and what that looks like.
GAO's Rebecca Shea on FedGov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time. That's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. The Office of Management and Budget lists cutting fraudulent payments as a priority in the new president's management agenda. The Government Accountability Office has found agencies, quote, aren't doing enough to evaluate their anti-fraud efforts. Rebecca Shea is Director of Forensic Audits and Investigative Services at GAO. Rebecca, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. There are 4 elements, I read, of the fraud risk management framework that you and your colleagues have established at GAO. Take me through those and help me understand how you got to this framework to help agencies figure out where their problems are. Welcome.
Thanks, Frances. Really appreciate you having me here to talk about our report and our work. So maybe a little bit of context is helpful here. We issued the fraud risk framework in 2015, and they're not just nice to do leading practices within it, they are required. And they're essentially the how-to guide for agencies to follow for implementing the Green Book, the Standard for Internal Control Principle 8 on managing fraud risk, and then also for meeting requirements from the Payment Integrity Act. And per OMB guidance, it directs agencies to follow our leading practices from the framework. And as you mentioned, there are 4 components of it. And I'll just do like the short components and then maybe like a longer overview. What's within those? So on the short side, we've got commit as the first component, assess, number 2, design and implement, number 3, and then evaluate and adapt, number 4. So a little bit on the longer side of what that means. So imagine a clock here, and sorry we don't start at 12. I'm going to start at 9 o'clock on this clock. And at 9 o'clock, you have the commit component, and that is commit to creating a culture and a structure to combat fraud. Now, with respect to that culture part, what that means is that you need to have the tone at the top and throughout the agency to promote an attitude and an awareness of combating fraud and what that means and what that looks like. In regards to the structure part, what that means is that you need to have people in charge of this, making sure that the trainings and the assessments and the evaluations, updating the fraud risk assessments, all of that is happening as it should. Agencies are big. They've got a lot of priority. So it helps to have somebody running point on that to make sure it gets done. So that's commit. At 12 o'clock, you've got the assess component. And within that, you've got leading practices to plan regular fraud risk assessments and to develop a fraud risk profile. And what that involves is looking at your inherent risks and looking at the controls that you have to address them. What's your fraud risk tolerance going to be? Like, what's the level of friction we want to have between prevention and detection? So that's number 2. At 3 o'clock, you've got design and implement. And this is kind of like the meat of internal controls, right? This component calls for an anti-fraud strategy that guides your activities, that's driven by that fraud risk assessment you did in component 2. It's got the specific controls like analytics to prevent and detect fraud. And that also talks about having collaborative relationships like with your OIG to implement your strategy. So that's the third component. And then lastly, we've got evaluate and adapt. You have to take a look at our controls. Is our approach working? And how do you know if your culture, your structure, your internal controls are actually doing what they're intended to do? And we offer a lot of ways to do that in this new guide. This new guide is essentially like, how do you do component 4 of the fraud risk framework?
All right, there's a lot there that I want to follow up on about each of these. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the first one that you talked about. Commit to combating fraud by creating an organizational culture and structure. And you touched on the structure piece that I wanted to get into. You said it's important to have people in charge of fraud efforts, to have somebody's name established as the person who does it. Is that something that you found in the past in agencies that they were lacking, or is it something that you found was important in the agencies that had success, or a combination of both maybe?
Yeah, I'd say it's a combination of all of the above. So that designated entity, as we call it in the framework, that can be an individual. And in some cases, for example, that's the chief risk officer or the CFO or, some other person, or it can be an entity, right? It could be a group of people. It can be at a high level. There are benefits to having that at a high level, such as like at the CFO office. And sometimes there are benefits to having that at an agency level, maybe a little bit lower because there's more familiarity with the program. So it can happen in a lot of different ways, but one of the things that we found is if you don't have this entity that has the connections to top leadership to make sure that they're advocating for fraud risk management activities and resources, that doesn't have the expertise in managing fraud risk, that isn't making sure that, trainings and other activities are happening, again, the priorities of an agency can kind of take over and it doesn't happen. So yes, it's really helpful in making sure that happens.
It sounds like an important element then is autonomy too, to be able to execute the agenda that you wind up developing later in the cycle that you described a couple of moments ago.
Yeah, that's right. The framework's clear that there's a fair amount of flexibility to apply the leading practices, in a way that you need to, that makes most sense for your agency.
All right, the fraud risk assessment element of this, the second piece, is assessing fraud risk similar to assessing other types of risks that agencies are always trying to assess and mitigate?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'd say yes, generally. The process where you think about what your inherent risks are and you get a lot of stakeholder input on that. You look at what's happened in the past, what could happen. You look to see what controls you have to manage that risk. You think about what your fraud risk tolerance is going to be and what are the likelihood and impacts of the risk, and then set your tolerance. And a lot of that process is similar to risk management for other areas. The one thing I'll mention about this, people oftentimes they'll get enterprise risk management and fraud risk management mixed up a bit. Those are processes that are maybe mutually reinforcing. There could be some program level fraud risks that once you elevate those to the enterprise level, you see, oh, wow, this is not just something that happens in the programs. This is like happening all over the agency. So that's important to like raise some of those risks up. But then the vice versa happens. There could be enterprise risks that need to be managed at that level. But there are program level risks that also need to be managed. So you can't just say, well, this is not an enterprise risk, and so therefore we don't need to manage it at the program level. No, all of the fraud risks need to be managed appropriately at the program level, whether they are enterprise level or not. So like a lot of interplay between those two levels is important.
All right. The third element that you talked about was designing and implementing a strategy, and you have a lot of good material on all of these points here, but this is the one in particular that I kind of sunk my teeth into, Rebecca. There are so much here, and you have terrific examples of ways that different agencies have tried to meet these. What are among the strategies that you've looked at, are there common elements among them that have been tailored to individual agencies, or does the mission set of an agency, the outcomes that they desire, and so on, does that inform the way that they build strategies to a point where I'm maybe not going to learn a terrific lesson from my agency from what some other agency has done?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe I'll pivot a little bit to how you might look at this from an outcomes perspective. So, maybe the first thing that people think about is, well, not every agency or not every program has a financial benefit. Sometimes there are financial benefits and sometimes there are non-financial benefits. And so you need to think about how you're implementing controls, but also measuring the success of that can look really different. And as an example, we talk about how the PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, OIG, they have a financial benefit that they give out to pensioners. And they did this data analytic exercise where they checked their payment data against, the death master file and some other databases, and they identified deceased individuals and ineligible individuals, and they cut those off. And in that like immediate activity, recognized about $1 million in savings. But then they also looked at the savings that was taking place from, essentially a preventive, right? If we had continued to pay these pensioners for the next 3 years, here's how much we, would have lost. And so they were able to talk about the discontinued future benefits. And that was almost like $500 million. So because that was a financial program, they're able to use that kind of financial measurement to talk about the impact, the return on investment, essentially, the cost savings from their financial intervention there. Now, think about another program like passports. Like, it's kind of hard to think about how you would have a financial accomplishment or a measurement from passports. But think about the passports in terms of national security impacts. So, one of the things, while they can't say we saved X amount of money from preventing passports from going to false identities or sanctioned individuals or tax cheats or a number of other things, they can talk about the numbers of those prevented and the national security risks that were mitigated as a result. So yes, the financial, non-financial nature of the program really can have an impact on what you're able to do.
What it sounds like you're getting at, though, is something that you and I touched on before we started recording, and that is understanding the outcomes that you want and measuring to those outcomes, which is the fourth one of these, is really where you determine how successful you've been, how well your strategy worked, how well the efforts that you took. And it also gives you an opportunity, then it sounds like, to be able to say, we need to readjust this or that thing moving forward if we want to get better outcomes. Am I reading that right?
Yes, that is right. That's what evaluate and adapt is all about. We don't want to keep implementing a control or paying for certain controls if they're not having the intended effect.
What are the best ways to measure the outcome achievement? I understand, as you very aptly described a few moments ago, it's not going to be financial every time, but is the work that one has done somewhere else in the process helpful to then measuring the outcomes and the degree of success that one has achieved?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about success in a variety of different ways. So there is, there's obviously like the financial cost savings or deterrence or return on investment, but there's also success in, we have created a culture that combats fraud, right? So we talk about different ways that you can evaluate all of the leading practices in components 1, 2, and 3. So, and I mentioned culture, so I'll just talk a little bit more about that. It's not necessarily like easily measured financially, but you can measure culture. And we did this with this review that we did of the XM Bank. We did an employee survey where we looked at tone at the top and tone in the middle. So sometimes an agency may be, saying all the right things. They're providing the tone at the top, but then within the middle, they're feeling a different way because there are performance goals or the processes are set up in a way that really act contrary to the tone in the middle. So we surveyed the XM Bank about this, and we did find that while there was a feeling that the leadership did support culture to combat fraud, the processes were set up in a way that did not provide, not everybody thought, provided adequate time to do the due diligence to check for fraud, right? So employee surveys are one way that you could identify some of these mismatches between tone at the top, tone in the middle, and also processes. So that's one way to evaluate culture.
Yeah, the culture piece of it in just about every aspect of improving government operations, folks say all the time, is the most difficult thing that they experience in how to move the needle on that.
Yeah, it is. Culture is hard to measure, but there's a lot of information out there, and now tools like natural language processing that we can use. I mean, think about how you can use natural language processing to evaluate all the communications from management. What are we actually saying about our tone at the top? And, our guidance, our training, and other things. I think there are a lot of tools out there where we can really see what the messaging is in its entirety.
As you move forward in this work, because I know you're not done, you're going to keep on this, Rebecca, what are the elements that you'll look at both within individual agencies to determine whether they've taken on this risk management framework that you've created and are implementing it, or whether they're still having difficulties in implementing it?
Yeah. So we'll continue to do a lot of the work that we have previously done, seeing how well agencies' practices align with the leading practices. We will, obviously look for examples that they have where they've examined their culture. Have they implemented some of the ways that we've suggested for measuring the effectiveness of their programs? Control testing is another thing that we highlight in the report. Have you tried to seed in some, documents, invoices, and receipts and see how far they've gotten? Things can look really good on paper, but then when you test them in actuality, stuff can fall apart. Have you adapted from there when, tried that and found out, we've got some gaps here and we need to adjust? So adaptation is something we'll also be looking for. I'd say deterrence is probably, maybe that's the final frontier of measuring and adapting. So there's a lot that's maybe easier to do to examine. Okay, we did this intervention, we did this analytics, and we know that we stopped X amount of dollars, or we minimized this type of security risk, or whatever it is. But how much did we actually deter? And how much did we keep the person who thought, the U.S. government is a lucrative opportunity for exploitation? How much did we deter that? I think that's a lot harder to measure. And we have some models and, some ideas in our outcomes report about how you might do that. But we're really looking to see growth and maturity in that. And that's really where we want to go, because that's even before the specific control prevention, that's speaking to the entire U.S. public, and beyond the U.S. public, because our U.S. government programs are targeted by, foreign actors as well. It's really about showing that the U.S. government is not an easy target. We are not an easy opportunity for fraud.
It's great to have you on the program, Rebecca. Thanks for talking about your work today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Francis.
You can find a link to Rebecca's work on fraud on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The Office of Personnel Management's consolidating more than 100 human resources systems across government into one. The director of OPM, Scott Cooper, will show you the plan on FedGov Today TV this Sunday morning. You can watch it at 10:30 Sunday morning on ABC7 in Washington and on the FedGov Today YouTube channel. And you can watch it all weekend long around the world on the American Forces Network. The next FedGov Today podcast is out this coming Tuesday. You can listen to that show and every FedGov Today podcast anytime you want on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.